Chicago, a city of beauty, strength, and power. Chicago, commercial capital of the nation.
You can do anything you want in Chicago.
They call Albert Lasker the father of modern advertising.
Leo Burnett probably is the best known of the Chicago ad giants.
Ronald McDonald and the Jolly Green Giant, and Tony the Tiger, and Snap, Crackle, and Pop, and Mr. Clean, Charlie Tuna, Pillsbury Doughboy, Morris the Cat. They were all created in Chicago.
Many of the major candy companies that are in brands that are still around today originated in Chicago. Milky Way, you have the Snickers, Three Musketeers.
The Chicago School of Advertising, and it was things like simple, direct language, be trustworthy, don't lie, be warm, but don't be mawkish.
Don Draper, the name came from my first boss, who was Draper Daniels at Leo Burnett.
One of the major publications that was birthed out of the influence of the Chicago Defender was Ebony and Jet magazine.
It was the most important advertising city in the United States.
Chicago was the first great city created just by Americans. The Philadelphias and New Yorks were created essentially as outposts of the old world. Chicago is the city that America creates when it turns its back on the old world.
Chicago was this place of outsiders, a place where there aren't set traditions, where there's not some old standards or society to say how things should be done. You could do anything you wanted in Chicago because nobody was here to tell you not to do it.
All kinds of cultural forms are coming out of here that are new.
Things like the first skyscrapers, the first Ferris wheel. There was creativity in politics, creativity in vice.
It was that Vegas before there was a Vegas.
It's a remarkable place where people are unafraid to try new things. Industries were thriving. One of the things that Chicago really had a hand in developing in the early 20th century, or even the areas around Chicago, is packaged goods. Chicago had to develop a whole way of doing commercial advertising and presentation. First, initially, to advocate for buying these things to begin with because the public was skeptical about them. You had people who worked in the factories assembling. You had things like the stockyards.
Meat is central to Chicago. It always has been. This is a meat city. Before the interstate highway system came along, meat had to be processed in Chicago. So on any given day, the Union stockyards on the south side had millions of heads of sheep, of pigs, of cows that went through this horrifying, frightening system of packing, of killing, and disassembling the animals that became really the inspiration for the assembly line. Henry Ford comes and sees how packing houses work, and from that, he develops what, in a way, modern American industry is based on.
Why Chicago? The perfect location. The railroads connected Chicago as the central hub.
North, south, east, west, they're all coming through Chicago. If you were taking a train from coast to coast, you had to stop in Chicago and change trains.
You made it a center for immigrants from other countries. There was just constant incoming of new people, immigrant groups from many different places.
Now, in the South, for African Americans, the Defender newspaper kind of promulgated the idea of Chicago as a place to go to.
The African American population in Chicago increased by about 150%.
It's really this center point of America at this point, and it just grows explosively, and it ends up becoming America's wonder city, maybe the world's wonder city, representing around the turn of the century everything about cities and everything about this growing country of America.
Some people wonder about, Chicago as an advertising town. It has been for a very long time, and some of the important movements in advertising really came from Chicago. One of them, of course, would be the mail order catalogs.
You had people living in rural locations who needed access to tools and household items.
There was an enormous market sitting out there. All those farmers out in those flat plains who wanted stuff.
And in the late 19th century, Aaron Montgomery Ward developed a catalog where you could send your money to Chicago, of all places.
It was the easiest point to distribute the product nationally because the lines go east, west, north, south from Chicago.
Two of the biggest companies in Chicago were Montgomery Ward's and Sears Roebuck's, kind of the original Amazon.
And they really did change the American economy. This was a whole new faucet being turned on.
You could order whatever you needed. Household goods and furniture, later radios, houses that came as kits. Local merchants who ran the town general store, they were furious about this. Don't send to Montgomery Ward, you're gonna get bad goods, you're gonna get cheated. So Chicago had to develop a whole way of doing commercial advertising and presentation to advocate for buying these things to begin with because the public was skeptical about them.
If you claim there is a Chicago School of Advertising, Montgomery Ward and Richard Warren Sears might have been the founders of that school. They were writing this amazing personalized copy with the Midwestern perspective, which is very sort of down to earth, in catalogs that were very nicely illustrated, and it was very compelling.
The mail order companies really depended upon kind of interesting gimmicks and advertising to make themselves known. And of course, Christmas is a time when you really want to be known. So they invented their own Christmas story, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which was the story of the outsider renegade reindeer. And soon it was like everything Rudolph. It just became a nationwide phenomenon. My dad worked for Montgomery Ward. This hung on my Christmas tree as a child.
How the reindeer loved him as they shouted out with glee. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, you'll go down in history.
Chicago is very important already as a distribution center for goods. But the advertising is not really important here, really until Albert Lasker.
Albert Lasker is arguably the father of modern advertising.
He was the first large figure in the business. He had more power and more influence for a longer time than anybody before or since. He spends 44 years in the business. When he was launched on something, when he had someone in his sights and he wanted to persuade them to do something, look out.
Lasker's agency, Lord & Thomas, was one of the largest agencies in the country. Lasker and Lord & Thomas rode that curve, and they stayed at the top or near the top of the heap for decades.
A lot of products that Lord & Thomas were selling actually changed how people lived. Pepsodent encouraged toothbrushing, which was something novel in the 1920s. Orange juice, something you had with breakfast, was something that was created by a Lord & Thomas campaign. Another great change was Kotex and Kleenex.
He invented things that are still with us in advertising today. When Albert was 26 years old, he became the half owner of Lord & Thomas. Albert rose so far and so fast because he was hyperkinetic. He had more energy than the next 5 people together.
Lasker is on a train one day with Cyrus Curtis, a major publishing figure. And he says to Lasker, look at this ad. This is one hell of an ad. You should hire this guy. Lasker then hires Claude Hopkins at $1,000 a week, when that was what a lot of people were making for a year. And most people would say Claude Hopkins is the greatest copywriter of all time.
By the time Lasker met him, he was tall, stiff-looking, parted his hair in the middle, foppish, and had a pretty severe lisp. And he would introduce himself to his colleagues as C.C. Hopkins, but it became, in the office, Fifi behind his back.
Hopkins liked to make what he called the preemptive claim. For Schlitz beer, he said, the bottles are washed with live steam. Well, all breweries washed their bottles with live steam, but Hopkins made the claim.
Hopkins was the master of restating the obvious. For Van Camp Pork and Beans, he talked about how they cooked the beans for hours at 245 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the way you cook beans. But if you tell the story first, it's your story. He could take pretty much any product and find fascinating aspects to it. He found these two things called puffed rice and wheat berries. And the thing about them was the grain was put into long metal cylinders and the stuff came flying out as puffed kernels. And he talked about food shot from guns. The advertising industry went wild. They said, this is the worst concept ever. Women don't want food being shot out of guns. Hopkins said, I know this is going to work. It worked. It was an astounding success.
He sort of pioneered in the reason why advertising. Here's why you should buy Palmolive soap. And he showed a picture of a beautiful schoolgirl. And the promise was, you'll get the schoolgirl complexion if you buy our soap.
They would apply that philosophy to everything they were selling and find reasons why the consumer needed this product. The other thing about Hopkins and Lasker is it's not just the copy, it's the context. We have to understand why it works. We get this works, but why does it work? The way that they did that was with coupons.
Coupons existed before Hopkins, but he made them his real trademark. Every ad he ever wrote practically had a little coupon down in the corner. And it is very useful because the coupon gets sent in to the advertiser and it tells them how were their sales connected to their ads. Nowadays, it's routine. There are whole companies that is all they do is track the results of ads and TV commercials and online ads. But in 1904, it was revolutionary. Lord and Thomas, under Lasker in the early 1900s, defined the modern ad agency because it had copywriters and art directors and account executives. Those are the three positions that have run the business ever since, and that is Albert Lasker's doing. Orange juice for breakfast was created by Lord and Thomas. People didn't have orange juice with breakfast until the Lord and Thomas campaign.
Eating an orange can be a pain. It's not simple. The per serving number of oranges went from 1 to 4 because you can't make a glass of orange juice with one orange. You gotta juice up a bunch of oranges. When World War I broke out, some inventive army nurses discovered this wood pulp product that would work really well when they were having their period. It was called Kotex, but it was a product that you couldn't talk about. You couldn't advertise it. And one of the places that wouldn't accept Kotex advertising was the Ladies' Home Journal. Ladies' Home Journal was owned and operated by Edward Bach, a potentate in American publishing. And Lasker decided to tackle the bull by the horns and said, I want you to advertise this because women need this. And Bach said, I'll tell you what, I'll let my secretary look at it. And if she thinks it's okay, I will run this ad. So Lasker had gotten past the secretary to get in there and his heart sank because this was a 60-year-old woman, very prim and proper, bun on top of her head, very conservative looking, and his heart sank and he said, I'm dead. So the two of them walk out into the outer office and they hand the copy to the woman with the typewriter and she reads it and she says, Mr. Bach, this is wonderful. Women should know about this. So Bach was now committed to running it and it went from not a product that you could talk about to a product that a lot of people counted on. Kleenex was made from the same stuff, and it was a makeup remover. Lasker's focus groups discovered that that was not the way to go because it was almost exclusively being used as a disposable handkerchief. At which point, they shifted gears and they said, this fights diseases. And they would have ads showing miserable people with horrible colds using Kleenex to protect the public and protect themselves.
So the idea of paper alternatives to handkerchiefs was a great improvement. It was a health improvement. Lasker particularly liked products that were just used a few times, maybe even just used once. He didn't go for big, expensive, durable goods. It's things that you use every day and that you have to buy frequently. So one of their major successes of the 20s was Pepsodent, the first really big toothpaste. This is hard to believe, but before World War I, people did not brush their teeth. The guys went into the army and were introduced to the toothbrush. And the habit took hold. And so the 20s are a time of a lot of stuff about dental care, toothbrushes, toothpastes. Pepsodent is a greatly successful product. Hopkins decides that what they can say about Pepsodent is it removes plaque, that yellow film on teeth. Maybe it did, Surely it didn't do it to any greater degree than any other toothpaste, but he makes the preemptive claim. Again, Hopkins says it before the competition says it. It makes Pepsodent the biggest toothpaste in the country at a time when people were really getting interested in the idea of brushing their teeth.
One time he said, there's this new ingredient in Pepsodent. They came up with this word irium, which means nothing, but it met Lasker's criteria. And then they blasted the nation with Pepsodent with irium. The American Dental Association was compelled to hire a full-time staffer to field questions from America about what is irium. Certainly, whenever anybody had a breakthrough, the rest of the industry would, shake their heads ruefully and say, I wish I had thought of that. And irium was certainly one of those breakthroughs. A real ingredient, a fake name, we see it today all the time, and we are still taken in. The team of Albert Lasker and Mary Lasker was a formidable one. They established the Lasker Foundation in part with the proceeds from his sale of Lord and Thomas. The first group they tackled was the American Society for the Control of Cancer. And Mary in particular hated that name. She said, controlling cancer is not a very ambitious target. It became the American Cancer Society. They made the organization go from being one that did no research to one that did a lot of research. This guy had more impact in the 20th century than anybody else. If you look across the range of things he did and the impact he had on American society, it was huge.
African Americans in the South during the turn of the century saw Chicago as the land of milk and honey, or they would call it the promised land. When they saw stories from the Chicago Defender saying, there's more jobs here than there are men to fill them. Come to Chicago and prosper, they were excited. People were dealing with Jim Crow on harsh levels. There were no job opportunities in the South. The weather conditions were horrible. So it was perfect timing to have a vehicle and be a voice for those who weren't normally heard.
A lot of the porters working the trains would circulate the Defender and bring it through the South.
That was a very prestigious job back then for African American men to have. And they would smuggle the paper on the trains because if they got caught, they would be fired or worse, and put them in various locations throughout the South. And then they would distribute it through the barbershops, the hair salons, and one paper would pass at least 5 hands.
And that is how a lot of African Americans found out about Chicago.
The Chicago Defender was a place where people like Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Charles Dawson, who was an amazing illustrator, had an opportunity to have their work displayed in such a beautiful way in the newspaper that the mainstream newspapers would never report. The two most famous artists around the turn of the century, and we're talking about the time when Bronzeville was really booming, were Charles Dawson and Archibald Motley. Archibald Motley painted a picture of the beauty of what was happening and the explosion of culture and life in Bronzeville in a way that no one else had captured. Dawson focused more on dealing with art through his illustrations and his advertising.
He had hopes of doing serious gallery easel artwork and created some very nice paintings from his training. But I think he also came to the realization that to succeed as an artist, you need to make money, and that's tough to do. And so he, basically working out of his apartment initially in 1919, opens a studio which is to specialize in creating art for advertising commercial products. He gets a job doing advertising for some of the early black manufacturers of cosmetics.
I think the major cultural trend that we saw because of these, the marketing and advertising specifically had to do with beauty, where women started to just really feel good about themselves. You're talking not too long after slavery. So they had an opportunity to really just find beauty in themselves and in others in a way that wasn't before, when they were especially in the South. Everything around hair, skin, you name it. That was a major part of the advertising dollars. Charles Dawson worked for Valmore Products during the time that there was a Great Depression in the 1930s. This is a time that people were suffering greatly, but for him, Valmore was kind of a savior in a sense. Not only gave him an opportunity economically to do well, it was a time for people to really see his talent.
A classic Dawson illustration. In fact, it's a very simple, almost cartoon-like line drawing. And they usually have jet black hair with shiny, jagged patches of white to show that it's really smooth. It's just areas of pure primary color, bright yellows and reds, something that can attract the eye on something really small at a great distance and really jumps right out at you. Valmore, by far, was not the first or the only company to develop hair care products and cosmetics and personal care items for African-American communities. But Valmore Products' obsession to generate advertising and to get attention to their products made it probably one of the more influential and wide-reaching of the companies. Charles C. Dawson's work was really different. And you look at some of his artwork that was done, say, in the 1930s and 40s, and the immediate thought is pop art that comes much later. Is there a tie-in to it? You can see the similarity in your mind and your eye. Could there possibly be a relationship of a company that made kind of small-scale operation, selling products to primarily African-American ethnic markets, find its way to the pop artists of decades later?
The makers of Johnson's Wax and Johnson's Self-Polishing Glow Coat present Marion and Jim Jordan as Fibber McGee and Molly with Bill Thompson, Jimmy Shields, and Billy Mills Orchestra. The show opens with Rise and Shine.
The use of advertising on radio was very controversial. A lot of people worried that having things enter your brain through your ears was going to be insidious, and we'd all be controlled by our radios.
Nobody knew what radio was going to be, and even there were restrictions that you couldn't use it for commercial purposes. In the early days, Chicago had evolved through its ad agencies and broadcast agencies a way to effectively get around it by naming the radio shows after whatever the product happened to be.
Swan, the new white floating soap that's pure as fine Castiles, brings you George Burns and Gracie Allen.
It was very seamless the way they produced these commercials for the program. They had you at the opening line. Then we'd have the story. Then we'd have another minute-and-a-half commercial. But it wasn't a commercial that really would hit you over the head. It was usually a very friendly-voiced announcer who would speak to you one-on-one, very sincerely, about the benefits of the product, whatever it was.
Chicago, by the 1930s, became a broadcast powerhouse. Many nationally broadcast radio shows came out of Chicago because in the center of the country, in the center of time zones, you could broadcast and syndicate.
There were all kinds of shows out of Chicago that were heard on the East Coast and the West Coast and from coast to coast.
The Amos and Andy Show.
It's still the most popular radio program that ever existed. 60% of homes tuned in Amos and Andy at night from 6 to 6:15.
I want to say that Mr. Rufus Dawes and Major Lawrence asked us to come up here and dedicate the Sky Ride, the Amos and Andy Sky Ride.
Amos and Andy was white actors portraying black family life.
Pepsodent took over the sponsorship of Amos and Andy in 1928.
Pepsodent removed dangerous films on teeth better than any other toothpaste.
And within a year, Pepsodent sales had doubled nationally.
On this, the first night of Amos and Andy's 8th year on the air for Pepsodent products, the Pepsodent Company wishes to express its gratitude and appreciation for the loyalty and fine showmanship of these two boys.
Andy, if the taxi cab business don't get better, I'm going back to my old job.
What old job?
I used to run a dairy.
You know I don't believe that.
Obviously, in retrospect, it was not very funny. After, 20, almost 25, 30 years of being an immensely popular program, the sensitivities of American advertisers changed, and the show ultimately ended in the controversies of the early 1960s. Well, Amos and Andy was perhaps the most famous show to come out of Chicago, but then there was Fibber McGee and Molly, which many people describe even today as probably the best written program of all time.
It's like a married couple that you're listening in on. It's something that people can relate to.
The Johnson Wax program with Fibber McGee and Molly.
Probably in the closet, and I'll get it for you.
Oh, no, you don't.
Johnson Wax Company, which is now the S.C. Johnson Company, really understood the power of being associated with a family-friendly broadcast.
Throughout the 30-minute broadcast, Harlow Wilcox, the announcer, whose nickname was Waxy, would knock on Molly McGee's door and say, that floor is looking a little grim there. We can polish that up, or how we can make that table shine.
Try Johnson's self-polishing glow coat on your floors. In 20 minutes, your floor is sparkling with new beauty.
Fibber McGee and Molly and Johnson Wax, they were synonymous with one another because of the branding that the company had with the program. They had all the commercials in the show. They did not share their spot load with anyone else. So it wasn't as if someone who was a regular listener to that show couldn't remember who the sponsor was. They remembered the sponsor because they were there day in, day out, or week in, week out, and they were there throughout the entire 30 minutes of the broadcast.
Branded content, we might call them today, or we might call them native advertising. That all started in Chicago. But the other movement that started in Chicago that was important to advertising, and I think maybe made Chicago the most important advertising center at that very moment, was the soap opera.
The first radio soap opera was Clara Lou and Em. It began as a skit with some sorority sisters at Northwestern, and their friends said, well, why don't you put this on the radio? And so that ushered in the concept of the radio serial or soap opera.
Chicago was a big place for soap operas. You heard Ma Perkins, Life Can Be Beautiful, The Adventures of Mert and Marge, you had Our Gal Sunday, you had all of these shows, and the stories were incredible. And all of these shows, these were all cliffhangers.
All of a sudden there's some crisis and then it stops. Tune in next week. And in many cases, these were oriented to women listening to the radio at home. And so products were promoted that would be more for housekeeping, and a lot of it being soaps and detergents.
Whether it was Procter & Gamble or Palmolive or Lever Brothers, everybody jumped on board and realized we can move a lot of soap during the day.
Ladies, there's a lot of talk today about new improvements in wash day products. But today I have still more interesting news for you.
And there weren't only soap operas. Chicago was a big place for the origination of kids' adventure shows like Superman and Jack Armstrong and Captain Midnight.
It's Captain Midnight! Brought to you by Ovaltine.
Almost every episode, you would hear a breathless announcer say, get your actual, genuine Captain Midnight secret decoder.
Write down these numbers, 17, 3, 20. Now, set your secret decoder for code A3. Then decode this important clue to next week's adventure.
All these sponsors were here, these corporations were here. I mean, without the advertisers there, you wouldn't have the programming.
Because of these major consumer companies, Chicago emerged as a very important production center where a lot of early broadcasting originated from.
My dad was looking for new worlds to conquer. So about 1930, he got the idea of starting Advertising Age. There was a need for the publication giving all the news of the advertising business, which was totally uncovered in those days. Nobody realized that the news was interesting. Account changes, ad campaigns, personnel changes, all that. Some of our best issues were on a century of advertising at the end of the 20th century. Best ads, the best jingles, the best advertising people.
The two great figures in Chicago advertising history, the whole 100-year-plus sweep, are Albert Lasker and Leo Burnett. And they were so different. They represented different kinds of advertising. Lasker is hard sell. He wants to make advertising a science. Burnett is soft sell. He thinks of advertising as a craft or an art.
He came from a rural town in Michigan. He believed in the Protestant ethic and the work ethic. He was very competitive, was very caring about people, and was a wonderful, gentle man, and advertising was everything in his life.
It takes him a while to get to Chicago. He doesn't come to Chicago until he's about 40. He doesn't start his own agency until he's 44. And the point here is that's really late to start an agency. It's in 1935. The Depression is still very much with us. It's lifted a little, but it's still very hard times. All he wants to do is soft sell. It's a hard selling decade. Most people start their shops in their 30s, and he's old. So he takes a jump off the diving board without any water in the pool, really, in 1935. And an advertising columnist who knows him says, this is doomed. He's going to end up selling apples on the street.
And he was like, not only will I not be selling apples, I'm going to give them away for free forever. That optimism of even when you're facing something that looks like it should not be possible, to show up and believe, you know, and show up again and again and again. And the fact that those apples are around the world on desks everywhere is amazing. And I also like it because I think it says to me that Leo Burnett understood legacy. And he built things that have lasted and endured and are still meaningful.
The first time I saw him in the hallway, here was this guy walking down the hall, and he was much shorter than I had expected. And he was followed by a group of these guys who were all aflutter. You know, they were talking to Leo and trying to make them so, and it was a strange, it looked like something from Little Abner. There was Leo walking resolutely down the hall, and these guys following him, like kicking up dust and trying to talk to him.
Leo always thought of himself as a Midwesterner and insisted that his ads reflected a certain politeness. Time to look at an ad and smile at it. You're not just rushing by it. Likability, amiability, and maybe more than anything, trustworthy. You can believe this ad because we're Midwesterners. We don't shuck and jive. We don't lie to each other like those evil Easterners. He always insisted on that, and you can see it in the ads. I mean, whether that's true of Midwesterners or not, that's what Leo thought, and he infused his advertising with that kind of attitude.
A big influence early on, when everyone was doing long copy, Leo, just to be different, decided to do big images. He loved Life magazine, and to spread a Pillsbury cake or a Marlboro cowboy in a 2-page spread in Life was something they weren't doing in New York. And Leo believed in the inherent uniqueness of each client, that each client had a personality, and we ought to try to portray it instead of portraying a personality that was the Leo Burnett Company. Every one of our clients deserved its own personality, and that's what he pushed us to find and to discover.
One of the striking things about the Burnett Agency is the stability of the clients. In a business where everything is unstable, somehow Burnett held on to major clients for 50 and 60 years. The Marlboro Man, the Good Hands people at Allstate, Jolly Green Giant. They stayed around for decades in a business where that is very unusual. And I think that says something about Leo, and it says something about life at his agency.
I remember I was on an airplane with him. I don't know why I was sitting next to him. Everyone else from Burnett may have had their hands full with him that day. They didn't want to be around him, but here I am, a young copywriter, sitting next to Leo. He said, you know how to make a martini? I said, yeah, I think so. I know how to make a martini. So I made him a martini, put an olive in. He looked at it. Norman, that's your name, right? I said, it's pretty good. It doesn't taste like an Iowa martini. And so I thought, this is it. It's my career. A lot of the early days of television happened in Chicago. Chicago started as a broadcast center in the 1920s that flourished with what developed into the major networks like NBC and CBS.
The production that was going on in LA was coming out of a more film model, so these were very expensive productions. They looked to Chicago to produce inexpensive, innovative television that could be done quickly, and Chicago delivered. The major difference of Chicago TV, its major innovation, was that it was not heavily scripted.
Chicago television people just kind of talk to you like they were talking to you over a table at a casual conversation or sitting next to somebody in a bar.
In a show like Studs' Place and a lot of the shows that were produced around the NBC affiliate at the time, it had a kind of freshness, a kind of innovation, but it was improvised.
And it became a style of television that became known as the Chicago School of Television. It all comes partially from kind of this no tradition, easygoing Midwestern underpinnings of Chicago, but also created a way of presenting television and advertising in a way that was perfectly comfortable to people in just kind of all walks of everyday life.
How do you do? My name is Dave Garraway, and I'm here, and gladly so, to tell you that television is ready for you.
The first one is Garraway at Large, hosted by Dave Garraway, which was really the big innovator in talk television. Garraway's direct address and kind of the way he breaks the fourth wall. He talks to everyone on the set, he talks to the dancers and the singers, and he talks to the audience in a way that is not like someone on a stage talking to a hall of 300 people. That was a real big change, I think, in television. So he became so popular that NBC in New York eventually snapped him up because they had a new show that they wanted to try out. Oddly enough, they thought people might want to watch TV in the morning. So they put him on a show called The Today Show.
And here is Dave Garraway. Well, here we are. Good morning to you.
Which worked very, very well, which convinced them that they should maybe put on a show for people who wanted to watch TV late at night, and they'd call that The Tonight Show.
Kukla, Fran, and Ollie was a puppet show.
A very important show, not just in its content. Here was a very gentle, wistful show about kind of not misfit puppets, but it was a whole Kuklapolitans were their own little nutty, idiosyncratic group of puppets.
But I just believe that if you worked a little harder in school, you'd come home with a little better report card.
I try to work, but I look out the window and all of a sudden I find myself kind of drifting and thinking and...
What do you think?
There also would be little underlying currents of kind of improvisational dialogue. You could pick up little bits of edge that were kind of adult, about adult themes. And they knew that there would be parents watching with their children. This was kind of an interesting new edge to television. It was a different way of doing children's television. And also, it works its way into how you do children's advertising as well, promoting an actual product by these same trusted figures that you see.
Kid, he can't open it. Why, you need 16 combinations to get in. Yipes! The secret! As I was saying... Hey, Cujo! Let me out of here!
Well, America's greatest advertising icons was an exhibit that we had here at the museum. And we looked at what are the greatest advertising icons. And we began to throw out names. Charlie the Tuna, and it was the Pillsbury Doughboy, and the Jolly Green Giant, and Mr. Clean. They're all great characters. And so we said, well, let's build an exhibit around these characters. And what we discovered was they were all created in Chicago. And that was a common denominator. Many of them obviously even came out of the Leo Burnett agency.
The Critter Agency is a name sort of given to Leo Burnett, and I don't think it was meant to be flattering.
They said at Leo Burnett in Chicago, they have a little closet where all of these characters are hidden, and they open the door and another character pops out.
I think that the business recognized that slogans were important, logos were important, but he started thinking about creating characters and that brands could create characters that could tell their stories.
They have been beloved by generation after generation. They're still moving product off the shelves now, after in some cases 75, 80 years of first being introduced.
And that was one thing that was very different. and it's what Leo Burnett brought to advertising. We have a character defining that product, which came from Leo's idea of inherent drama.
Snap, crackle, pop, Rice Krispies.
In 1951, Kellogg's was looking for a way to sell Frosted Flakes. The initial concept was to have 4 different animals that were going to rotate as sort of the spokes animals, if you will. It was an art director by the name of Gene Kolke who came up with the idea of Tony the Tiger because they thought that he played well and you could do more with the tiger and the alliteration of Tony the Tiger, and so thus was created Tony the Tiger.
Got my one-man band here to help tell you about these great Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes. Okay, son, when I nod my head, hit it. A 1, a 2, a 3. Oh, no!
The first time the Jolly Green Giant was in a commercial, he was walking like a zombie or Frankenstein, and he was too scary.
Corn and tender peas, the Jolly Green Giant will set up your table with golden corn and tender peas. The Jolly Green Giant is he.
So they had to send him back to rewrite, and they softened him up quite a bit, and he became a jolly Green Giant, not a threatening Green Giant.
He never again walked on TV. He stood there ho-ho-hoing and his arms akimbo like that and gesturing and so on, but he never walked.
In 1961, StarKist hired Leo Burnett Agency to come up with a character for Charlie the Tuna. They presented this winning campaign called Charlie the Tuna. It was an animated tuna who believed that he was so hip and cultured, his good taste would be perfect for StarKist.
Charlie, what's that?
Something for StarKist to take note of.
Oh. How much good taste you got?
I got so much good taste, I put slipcovers on rocks.
Yeah, but they don't want tunas with good taste. StarKist wants tunas that taste good.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, Charlie.
Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country.
Personally, I worked on, well, most prominently Marlboro and did the Marlboro Cowboy, which at the time there wasn't the link between smoking and cancer that developed. The Marlboro Man was a campaign developed in 1955, and it originally involved guys with interesting backgrounds, and they had a tattoo to symbolize that. There were several of us who came up with the idea, and it came basically from a Life magazine article that featured a cowboy. We were trying to establish the fact that Marlboro was a flavorful cigarette, and a cowboy was the symbol for that. Philip Morris again researched it, and the research company came back and said, you'll run it out of business in 6 months if you run this advertising. You sell cigarettes in the city, and no one in the city has ever seen a cowboy. Well, that was the idea. That was what we had in mind. So again, they ran it, and it became a very successful campaign. In the 60s, Leo Burnett shot more film than any agency in the world, and more film in a year than any feature film company.
Come to Marlboro country.
In 1971, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act went into effect. This law banned the advertising of cigarettes and tobacco products on television and radio.
Two of the most omnipresent features of modern American life surely are McDonald's and fast food, and they both come out of Chicago companies.
If you go back to that time, McDonald's wasn't what McDonald's is today.
Ray Kroc is a uniquely Chicago guy. He ends up running a company that sells Mixmasters. And he comes across one account in San Bernardino. They take 30, 40 Mixmasters. So he goes to see it, and it's run by these two brothers, the McDonald's brothers. They've created this fast food kind of factory where you can see what's being made. They deliver it quickly, and they deliver quality food to you. They use the best meat, the best shortening, the best bread. Ray actually falls in love with this. What he wants to do is recreate McDonald's throughout America. So he franchises McDonald's in the spring of 1955 and opens the first one under his franchise in Chicago in Des Plaines because he was also about the suburbs. There wasn't a lot to do out in the suburbs, so maybe we'll throw the kids in the car and go to McDonald's. So the idea of early McDonald's was providing kind of this quality family experience.
By 1970, my big break came. we were asked to pitch for McDonald's national business, and they had never had a national campaign before. They did not have McDonald's restaurants in every state, but Ray Kroc, the founder, wanted a national campaign that would air even in states that did not have a McDonald's. We would build up this anticipation so that when he put a store there, they would line up for blocks to get in. So now we win the business and we have to come up with a campaign. And we find that women are entering the workforce in the early 70s, find meal planning boring, how can I get away from it? So the idea of getting away was important.
You Deserve a Break Today at McDonald's was a breakthrough campaign because it gave moms in particular permission to go to McDonald's. It's like, I do deserve a break today. Not that you want a break, you need a break, you deserve a break today.
Well, this is a special issue of Advertising Age published at the end of the last century in 1999, and it lists the top campaigns of the century, the top jingles of the century, the top slogans of the century. And You Deserve a Break Today, they ranked #1. So it got into the popular culture. One writer in the day said, McDonald's advertising has made it almost unpatriotic not to take our families to McDonald's.
To all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun.
Somebody told me last week that more people know the ingredients of a Big Mac than know the 10 Commandments. And I said, that's because Moses didn't have a jingle writer. One of the people I was very privileged to work with was Tom Burrell. He was a copywriter in the next cubicle next to mine at the Needham Agency. And then, of course, he started his own agency, and he's done brilliantly. He's now in the Advertising Hall of Fame.
Burrell was founded in 1971.
It started as an African-American target agency.
One of the mantras of the agency starting out was, black people are not dark-skinned white people.
Just because you put this out there for everybody, it does not resonate with all of your demographics.
Even though we enjoy so many of the same things, how we live, the churches we go to, the clothes we wear, the brands we embrace and why we embrace them. We use the same products, but so many different ways. So we are the same, but we're not.
When I began, there were 12 of us, and we were half a floor. Working at Burrell was not working at an ad agency. We were a family. It was an adventure. The bad side of it, it was hell. It was us against the world.
We were seen as small. We were seen as less professional, less business-like. I mean, before they got to know us. The whole idea about institutionalized racism is that there is a genuine feeling at some level that we require less. I remember having conversations with clients. They would say, don't tell us what you can do for us. We have you here because we want to help you. What we can do is we can do you a favor by giving you some business. And if we give you business, if we're giving it to you, you should be happy with whatever we give you.
Our ideas has to be just as professional, just as strong, just as strategic, and we have to do it with a fraction of the money.
McDonald's is a part of happy memories. The big breakthrough for us was McDonald's in 1972. And what McDonald's afforded us was the thing that revolutionized the business and actually put us in the Hall of Fame and put us in the Library of Congress, and that is television.
Double Dutch is an example of that difference between general market and niche market. You eat pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving. We eat sweet potato pie.
Big Mac, filet of fish, quarter pounder French fries, icy Coke, big shakes, Sundays apple pies. If you're hungry for your favorite taste, hey.
And up until that point, black advertising agencies were pretty much restricted from being in the television game.
The fear had been, oh, if we put this black family, it's only going to talk to black people and it's going to turn off our white audience.
What we did is we convinced McDonald's that if we were given the opportunity to do television, that it would not turn off the white consumer. That, on the other hand, it would actually turn on the white consumer while it was turning on the black consumer. They had never seen themselves projected in media, especially advertising, in a positive way, in a positive, realistic way. The other thing that McDonald's did was got us through the doors of Coca-Cola. One of our first spots that we did for Coca-Cola was a street song depicting one of the things that is a mainstay in our community, and that's doo-wop singing.
Ooh, yeah, Coke has life. 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 You're living nice.
That commercial captured the reality of black life, the positive reality of black life, shot in a black neighborhood setting. It was entertaining to the general public as a whole.
There was a Coca-Cola spot with the Coke marching band.
That was a really famous commercial. People have never seen a marching band march like that. Normally people have seen in the Rose Bowl parade, everybody's then here's this band. They're stepping and doing all this stuff. America hadn't seen anything like that before, but we have. We've been seeing Grambling Band do that for years.
You can get when it comes to big taste, get the biggest taste, yeah. Cookies, it's the biggest taste you've ever found.
Burrell was not the first black agency. It just became the foremost.
So many people, so many consumers didn't know a lot about African-American culture. We, through our advertising, exposed America and the general market to African-American culture.
Chicago, a great empire set in the heart of America. Vast, vital, stimulating. Today it is an empire, the culmination of the dreams and labors of great men. Chicago, the most American of American cities.
A number of factors came into play that started to drain Chicago's importance as a central place in America. Maybe the most kind of, I think, tragic things that happens is the transcontinental jet. At a certain point, by law, if you were taking a train from coast to coast, you had to stop in Chicago and change trains. Suddenly, in the late 50s and early 60s, you can fly over from LA to New York and back without having to stop in Chicago. Chicago really did have that role in the American imagination as both an intellectual and cultural pioneer, but also as a place you could gamble. The growth of Las Vegas as this kind of entertainment-free zone, that really was one of the things that Chicago had at its heart. That idea of a place where people go to party and gamble and shop, now that's about Vegas and not Chicago anymore. Chicago's television draining away was really maybe the start of the drain of Chicago talent that happens throughout the 50s through the 60s. The Chicago School of Television really was a golden age. The sad thing about it is that it was very, very short. It was really only 2 or 3 years before people like Garraway, some of the behind-the-camera people, began to be drawn away to New York.
Despite Chicago's diminishing stature, great advertising work still pumped out of Chicago. I think it was 10 or 11 years in a row we had the highest rated commercial on the Super Bowl. I talked about talk value in that I wanted us to be doing work that people talked about, that people like seeing, you know, that they told their friends about. You've got to see that crazy What's Up commercial. You got to hear these crazy radio spots, you know, Real Men of Genius. One of our biggest hits on the Super Bowl is, of course, our Clydesdale commercials. And I said, we've got to give the Clydesdales a personality. We've got to have some fun with the Clydesdale. We have to create stories about the Clydesdales. So one of the first ones we did was the Clydesdales kicking the extra point, and that was a very expensive commercial at the time. So it took kind of a leap of faith to do it.
They always do that? Nah, they usually go for 2.
That became a very memorable commercial, and we followed with all kinds of Clydesdale spots. Does advertising follow the popular culture, or does it create culture? Our teams here were trying to create culture. One of the campaigns that got the most talk value, of course, was Up for Budweiser.
Hello?
What's up? So my fervent dream was to have everyone in America shouting, "What's up?"
What's up?
What's up?
What's up?
What's up?
What's up?
Hold on. Hello?
So what's up, B? Watching the game, having a bud.
It became a global phenomenon.
In the original film, it was Charles Stone and his friends, basically, who were roped in for this random video shoot in New York, I believe it was, in an apartment in New York. And they were all childhood friends. And they've been doing this on the phone for years and years and years. And so that was the film I saw. I couldn't not play this for other people, and they would go, "What's up? What's up?" So I had this notion that this was kind of irresistible. Like, it was based in reality. "What's up" is American for hello. So conceivably, everybody could say this 10 times a day. If I'd had this idea myself and wrote it out, it wouldn't have gotten off the ground. "What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up?" It doesn't tell well. This one doesn't. That's why I'm glad we have the film.
Actually, we tried to cast, you know, like a politically correct cast of, you know, a Hispanic guy, a white guy, and it was terrible.
My thing was that if we got it right like the film did, it just couldn't fail. Like, I was just so convinced that we had gold here and we just got to do this.
It was controversial for a number of reasons.
Which was the weirdest part of it for me. After this had aired, the account guy on the Bud account pulled me into his office and he showed me 2 stacks of printouts. One was African Americans who were angry at the campaign, and the other was Southern white racists who were angry at the campaign for completely different reasons. The racists were angry because we were besmirching the good brand of Budweiser, which they associated with white America. Older African Americans were appalled that we'd, you know, besmirched young African American maledom with this minstrelsy blackface campaign and their idea. And I was like, "Are you kidding me? How can we outrage both of these groups at the same time?" And I remember that the client, quite wisely, looked at who's loving it. Young American drinkers are loving it. So they went with the economics of it and made the right decision to keep the campaign going.
We thought we had a commercial there. It turned out to be a whole campaign. It went viral before we even knew what viral was.
One of the things we still have in the office is his lockbox. So this is Albert Lasker's lockbox that he always had, that he kept on his desk, and we had some of his key letters or documents in here. So whenever a new leader takes over the leadership of his office, we hand this over to this new person. There are letters in there right now, I can't share them with you, because they're all the secrets of how to build big brands. Then when Albert Lasker made a decision in 1942, when he retired, to give 3 of his key leaders, Foot, Thorne, and Belding, the name rights. So we have some long-standing relationships in the city. Because you're married for 30 years, it doesn't mean you will be married tomorrow. Every day you have to wake up and regain the love and the trust in that relationships. It's very similar to having clients. For me, it's so important that we have the long-lasting relationships that we truly understand their brands.
Some of our long-standing relationships at BBDO are Wrigley, Bear, S.C. Johnson. To give you a history of the Wrigley brand and how it's evolved, I could literally show you a presentation called The 100 Years of Gum. So going back that far, all Wrigley made was chewing gum. So you could argue those were flavors, but not to them. They created individual brands. William Wrigley Jr., the founder, had a mantra, which was tell 'em quick and tell 'em often. So as a guy who believed in brands and a guy who believed in advertising, he believed that you kept your advertising agency very, very close and as a partner in your business.
The State Farm relationship with our agency began in 1929. It's still going on. In 1975, State Farm had been advertising their low price. But one of these young women in research came to us one day in the creative department and said, you know what? Based on everything I've seen in the research and people I've talked to, the real product that State Farm should be selling is not the policy or the low cost, but that local, friendly agent in the neighborhood. So once we had that insight, it was pretty easy to come up with, just like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Barry Manilow then was enlisted to write the tune. And he wrote this wonderful tune in minor key, because this was insurance. Whenever you're driving, wherever you're bound.
You'll feel better knowing anytime, anywhere, that like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
It was the period when agencies and clients had a relationship built on trust. And they went out together, they did things together, they were very direct and frank with each other, and they made wonderful advertising together. If I think about the heyday, we had one-on-one relationships with CEOs.
I think what happened and led to a change was the brand manager system. When brand managers came in, they wanted unequivocal numbers to prove what they were doing was right.
You're dealing at several layers below, and you're getting briefs for projects as opposed to long-running campaigns. And I think that will eventually hurt brands. There's a difference between creating a buzz and creating a brand. There's a difference between contact and connection. There's a difference between an algorithm and a human insight. And there's a big difference between big data and a big idea.
When you look at Albert Lasker's concept of salesman in print, I believe half of this is as true as ever before. But I would rename it as salesmanship and emotion. Because nowadays, to sell, we have to build a true emotional connection between our consumers and our clients' brands.
We understand emotion is what drives consumers' connections to brands. And that's something we've always understood here, you know? We've gotten the head, but we've always gotten the heart.
There's always been a tension in advertising. Can a creative advertising agency keep its mojo as it gets bigger? Can they keep doing inventive, daring stuff when the stakes are so high, really big accounts? So he makes this speech, and it's about what would happen if we ever lose our kind of advertising.
It feels like it was written yesterday.
This agency means everything in the world to me, especially its philosophy and its character. And so does its future. Not just next year and the year after that, but 10, 20, even 50 years from now, especially if my name is still connected with it.
I think that his sense of ethics and responsibility, his love of craft, all of those things were important then and I think still important now. We have this philosophy, humankind, and we have a 1 to 10 scale that we look at work. It's not, you know, bad to good to great. It's really about what the work does. When you get up into the 7, 8, 9, 10, 7 is a beautiful idea, brilliantly told, well crafted. 8 starts to be about changing the way people think and feel. 9 changes the way people act or behave, and 10 changes the world. The crash test dummies were done at Leo Burnett. That changed the way people behave. We would call that a 9 piece of work. They went out and made people go from not wearing seatbelts to wearing seatbelts. It's a great reminder of how the things that we create can have incredible meaning.
But let me tell you when I might demand that you take my name off the door. That will be the day when you spend more time trying to make money and less time making advertising, our kind of advertising. When you forget that the sheer fun of ad making and the lift you get out of it, the creative climate of the place, should be as important as money to the very special breed of writers and artists and business professionals who compose this company of ours and make it tick. When you are no longer what Thoreau called a corporation with a conscience, which means to me a corporation of conscientious men and women. When you begin to compromise your integrity, which has always been the heart's blood, the very guts of this agency. When the apples come down to being just apples for eating or for polishing, no longer part of our tone, our personality. When you disapprove of something and start tearing the hell out of the man who did it, rather than the work itself. Even if I have to materialize long enough some night to rub it out myself on every one of your floors. And before I dematerialize again, I will paint out that star-reaching symbol too, and burn all the stationery. Perhaps tear up a few ads in passing, and throw every goddamn apple down the elevator shaft. You just won't know the place the next morning. You have to find another name.